Welcome, fearless listeners, to Phantom Fables, where the dark of night's filled with a haunting tale or two and even some eerie whispers too. Tonight we venture into a cursed village so shrouded in the glowing moon. Be warned, this is not just a story, it's a descent into darkness. Under the haunting moonlight, ancient curses awaken, and the whispers of the damned fill the air. Those who dare to listen must beware the secrets they uncover. This is the chilling tale of the Moonlit curse. In the year 1603, nestled on the edge of an ancient forest, the small Polish village of Gorinsky seemed like a world unto itself. The villagers lived simple lives, tilling the fields by day and gathering around fires by night, sharing tales of old. Yet for all its simplicity, Gorinsky bore a shadow one that grew long and menacing under the pale light of the full moon. This shadow came from the forest, known to the locals as Czarny Las. Tales of unnatural whispers and ghostly figures emerging from its depths had kept even the bravest at bay for centuries. But the most unsettling of all was the legend of the Moonlit curse. It was said that on the night of the full moon, the forest came alive, claiming anyone foolish enough to enter its embrace. This was mere folklore to some, but to others, it was a living nightmare. Among those who believed was Esther, a spirited young woman with a curiosity that often led her to places she shouldn't be. Esther's fascination with the forest was no secret, and though her brother Hiram often chastised her for wandering too close, she always dismissed his warnings with a wave of her hand. On the night of the harvest moon, Esther disappeared. The next morning, at dawn, the village was wrapped in unease. Esther's disappearance had struck fear into the hearts of the townspeople, who whispered to each other and cast suspicious glances toward the forest. Hiram, a young man of 25 with a sharp mind and a thirst for knowledge, refused to give in to despair. He told himself, tightening his grasp on the small silver star on a thin chain that Esther had left, "She's alive." It was a simple thing, but holding it, he could feel the warmth of it. Yet Hiram knew his sister wouldn't have gone into the forest without reason, and yet the villagers insisted otherwise. "She has been taken by the curse," one of the elders declared, his face weathered grave. "The forest has taken her just like it had others before. Let her be, Hiram. To set foot in Czarny Las is to ask for death." But Hiram did not believe in ghost stories. He was a rational man who sought facts, not fear. Equipped with a lantern, a map, and determination, he headed out to find his sister despite the protests from the villagers. The forest was silent, its stillness broken only by the rustling of leaves. The deeper Hiram went, the more oppressive the air became, as if the trees themselves were watching. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, but each time he turned, he found nothing. Hours went by, and the sun started to set, throwing long shadows on the forest floor. Hiram paused to catch his breath, studying the map he had brought along. It marked a path to an old burial site, a place the villagers avoided at all costs. As he followed the route with his finger, a soft voice broke the silence. "Hiram." He froze, his heart pounding. The voice was unmistakably Esther's, but it was faint, almost distant. "Esther," he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. "Where are you? Help me." The voice came again, this time closer. Without thinking, Hiram grabbed his lantern and ran toward the sound, his feet crunching against the dry leaves. The forest seemed to shift as he moved, the trees growing closer together, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Hiram stumbled, catching himself against the trunk of a tree. When he looked up, he saw it, a clearing bathed in silver light. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with runes that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The air chilled further as Hiram stepped closer to the altar. His breath appeared visible in the cold. There was an unnatural energy emanating from the stones, a power that made his skin crawl. A small piece of cloth was on the ground close to the altar, Esther's shawl. "Esther!" he cried out, his voice shaking. All that answered was the whispering of the wind, carrying words he could not understand. The runes on the altar flared to life as he reached for the shawl, casting the clearing in an eerie light. Hiram stepped back, his eyes shielded. When the light dimmed, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A woman draped in a tattered cloak, her face hidden in shadow. "Who are you?" Hiram demanded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The woman stepped forward, her movements fluid and otherworldly. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. "The forest is not kind to intruders." "I'm looking for my sister," Hiram replied, his grip tightening on the lantern. "She came this way. Do you know where she is?" The woman tilted her head, her dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "She has been marked," she said cryptically. "The curse has chosen her." "What curse?" Hiram demanded. "What are you talking about?" Before the woman could answer, a low growl rumbled through the clearing. The trees around them seemed to shudder, their branches twisting unnaturally. "She's coming," the woman whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "You must leave. Now." But Hiram was not ready to let go. As the ground beneath him started shaking, he stood firm, knowing that he would find Esther and discover the reason behind the curse. The forest seemed to come alive, with shadows moving in purpose, closing in on him. Little did he know, his search for his sister would lead him to secrets buried deep within the heart of the forest, secrets that would change his life forever. The clearing was alive with movement. Shadows stretched unnaturally, contorting into shapes that seemed almost human, yet grotesquely wrong. Hiram stood frozen, clutching the lantern tightly, as the eerie woman before him backed away into the encroaching darkness. "Who is coming?" Hiram demanded, his voice trembling. She didn't respond, her dark eyes fixed on the moving forest. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered again, her voice heavy with portent. "The forest feeds on trespassers, and tonight, it is awake." Before Hiram could answer, a deafening roar shattered the silence. The ground beneath him shook, and the ancient trees surrounding the clearing groaned as if alive. The woman's form dissolved into the shadows, leaving him alone with whatever was emerging from the forest's depths. Hiram's instincts screamed at him to flee, but his resolve held firm. He was here for Esther, and no amount of ghostly warnings would deter him. Turning toward the altar, he noticed the runes glowing faintly once more, their light pulsating in rhythm with the tremors. Clutching Esther's shawl, Hiram advanced toward the altar, his gaze running over the carvings. The symbols looked nothing like any he had encountered in his research. They were jagged and almost violent in their design, yet possessed a strange rhythm to them, like fragments of an old hymn. As he followed the grooves of one rune, he felt a jolt of energy rush through him. His vision went dim, and he was overcome with a montage of brief images. A village burning to ashes, a shadowy figure standing atop the altar, and a woman's anguished scream echoing into the void. Hiram stumbled back, gasping for air, as the vision receded. His heart beat rapidly, and around him, reality seemed to sway. The moonlit clearing became a place awash with crushing darkness. Someone whispered in his ear, although no one stood there. "Leave, before it claims you too." Ignoring the voice, Hiram concentrated on the symbols. He had seen something in the vision, a pattern among the runes that seemed to form a map. But a map to what? As his mind reeled, the sound of footsteps came from the darkness, slow and deliberate. "Hiram." The voice was unmistakably Esther's, but it was distorted, as if spoken through water. Hiram turned sharply, raising the lantern, but the light revealed nothing. "Esther!" he shouted, his voice echoing. "Where are you?" No response came, but the footsteps grew louder. Desperate, Hiram stepped away from the altar, moving toward the sound. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches forming a labyrinth of shadow. As he walked down twisting paths, he noticed something unusual. The floor of the forest was strewn with bones. At first, they were small, almost like animals, but as he proceeded further into the forest, the remains became bigger, almost human. Hiram's stomach turned around, but he continued forward, following the faint sound of Esther's voice. He stumbled through the suffocating darkness, minutes seeming like hours. Finally, he emerged into another clearing, smaller than the first, but no less eerie. In its center stood a withered tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. At its base lay a stone slab, cracked and weathered with age. On the slab was Esther. "Hiram," she whispered, her voice weak. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, relief flooded his chest. But as he approached, he noticed something was wrong. Esther's skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were tinged blue. Strange symbols were etched into her arms, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Esther," Hiram cried, falling to his knees beside her. He shook her gently, but her body was cold to the touch. "What happened to you? Who did this?" She blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused. "The forest," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It called to me. I couldn't stop it." Before Hiram could say a word, the ground beneath them shook once more. The air became heavy, and a low hum filled the clearing, vibrating in his chest. "They're coming," Esther whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Who?" Hiram demanded, his voice cracking. "Who's coming?" But before she could answer, the shadows around them began to move. Figures came out of the darkness. They were tall, faceless, and wore black cloaks. Their forms shifted with every step, yet their presence was unmistakably threatening. Hiram stood between Esther and the figures, holding up the lantern as a shield. "Back!" he yelled, though his voice shook with fear. The figures stopped, their eyeless gazes fixed on him. One of them stretched out an elongated arm and pointed straight at Esther. "She is ours," a voice hissed, low and echoing, as though spoken by many at once. "No!" Hiram snarled, his grip tightening on the lantern. "You can't have her!" The figure tilted its head as if amused. "The curse cannot be undone," it said. "She belongs to the forest now, as will you." Desperate, Hiram looked around the clearing for something to protect himself with. There was something carved into the wilted tree, like the runes on the altar, but these pulsed with a glow, so bright that it stood in rhythm with the thrum. Acting on instinct, Hiram reached out and touched the tree. A burning pain shot through his arm, but he didn't let go. The runes flared, and the figures recoiled, hissing in unison. The light from the runes intensified, spreading across the clearing like wildfire. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, until finally, there was silence. When Hiram opened his eyes, the clearing was empty. The figures were gone, and the oppressive weight of the forest had lifted. Turning to Esther, he saw that her color had returned, and the glowing symbols on her arms had faded. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded weakly, her eyes filling with tears. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." Hiram steadied her up on her feet, and together they stumbled back toward the village. But the more he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Unbeknownst to Hiram, the runes he activated had now found their way to awakening something far older and much more dangerous than the curse of the forest. The shadows may have retreated for now, but their hunger remained. And the forest was patient. It felt like an eternity walking back to the village. Hiram and Esther moved in silence, the flickering light of the lantern barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The forest seemed alive, its trees shifting and groaning as if displeased by their escape. Hiram kept glancing over his shoulder, convinced that the shadows were still following them. "Do you hear it?" Esther's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Hiram asked, his grip tightening on her arm. She paused, tilting her head as though straining to listen. "The whispers. They're calling my name." Hiram froze, his heart pounding. He strained his ears but heard nothing beyond the rustling leaves and the faint chirp of crickets. "There's nothing, Esther. It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," she said, staring at him with fearful eyes. "They're real. They've been following me since the altar." Esther refused to keep going until they stopped to listen. Reluctantly, Hiram snubbed out the lantern, sending them into blackness. There was only silence for a moment. Then, from far away and faint, he heard unmistakable voices. "Hiram," one of them whispered, cold as ice water. The voice was familiar. It was his mother's. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's not real. It's a trick." But the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of disembodied voices. They spoke in languages he couldn't understand, their tones filled with anger, sorrow, and despair. Esther clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "They're getting closer," she whimpered. Hiram lighted the lantern again with shaking hands. Its rays sent shadows off, but voices did not fade. Instead, they seemed to pull back in the woods, like they were calling them away from the shelter. "We should go," he whispered, dragging Esther to follow him. "Don't listen." Dusk had barely broken over the edges of the village by the time they reached it. The sunlight would have felt warm and welcome under other circumstances, but only showed how bereft the village had become. The marketplace, once filled with chattering people, stood abandoned and silent. All its stalls had been overturned. The houses are dark because all their windows were broken. All their doors hang ajar. "What is wrong here?" Esther whispered, shivering. "I don't know," Hiram admitted, though dread coiled in his stomach. "Let's find the others." They walked to the synagogue, the largest building in the village, where everyone converged in times of trouble. Heavy wooden doors with a crack wide enough to push into creaked as they pushed inside. Thick air filled their nostrils, wax and mold, and soft candlelight outlined the pews. The building appeared empty at first, but once their eyes had adjusted, they could see the villagers huddled together at the front, pale and drawn faces. Rabbi Eliyahu stood at the pulpit, clutching a Torah scroll as if it were a lifeline. "Rabbi!" Hiram called out in a voice that echoed in the silent space. The villagers turned as one, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Hiram! Esther!" the rabbi exclaimed, rushing toward them. "Thank God you're alive." "What's happening?" Hiram asked. "The village, it's deserted." Rabbi Eliyahu's face darkened. "The curse," he said grimly. "It has returned." Hiram frowned. "What curse? What's going on?" The rabbi gestured for them to sit and began to explain. "Many years ago, our ancestors angered the spirits of the forest. They desecrated sacred ground, cutting down trees to build this village. The spirits warned them to stop, but they didn't listen. And so, the forest cursed them." "What kind of curse?" Esther asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The curse of the moonlit nights," Eliyahu replied. "On nights like this, the forest awakens, claiming those who wander too far. They are never seen again." Hiram's mind raced as he pieced together the events of the previous night. "The altar," he said suddenly. "There were runes on it, symbols I've never seen before. And there were figures in the forest. They said Esther belonged to them." The rabbi's face turned ashen. "You've seen the shadowed ones," he said gravely. "They are the enforcers of the curse, guardians of the forest. If they've marked Esther, then her soul is at risk." "No," Hiram said firmly. "We won't let them take her." But the rabbi shook his head. "You don't understand. The curse cannot be broken. Those marked by the shadows are doomed." "There's gotta be a way," Hiram insisted. "What about the runes? Those seem to drive the shadows off themselves." Eliyahu shrugged, then slowly nodded. "There are tales, legends of a method to lift the curse, but it is dangerous." "Tell me," Hiram said steadily. The rabbi sighed. "Deep within the forest lies the heart of shadows, the source of the curse's power. If the heart can be destroyed, the curse will be broken. But no one who has ventured into the forest to find it has ever returned." "I'll do it," Hiram said without hesitation. "No," Esther cried, grabbing his arm. "It's too dangerous." "I have to," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "If I don't, the shadows will take you." The rabbi handed Hiram a map, hastily sketched onto parchment. It showed the rough layout of the forest, and only one path led to the heart of shadows. "Follow this," he said. "But be warned, the forest will try to stop you. It will use your fears against you." Hiram nodded, his jaw set. "I'll be back before sunset," he said, squeezing Esther's hand. "You'd better be," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. As he left the synagogue and stepped back into the forest, Hiram couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed darker than before, and the whispers had returned, louder and more insistent. "Hiram!" They called, their voices overlapping like a chorus of the damned. "Come to us." He paid them no mind, intent on the map, but the deeper he traveled, the stranger the forest grew. The trees became taller and twisted, their branches forming an impenetrable canopy. The air chilled, and the ground beneath his feet turned to mud. Hours dragged by, impossible to tell what time it was because everything was so dark. Hiram's lantern flared and went out a little at a time, and the whispers grew louder with each step. Then, suddenly, he heard that other voice. "Hiram, help me!" "Esther." He spun sharply around, his heart racing. "Esther? Where are you?" "This way," the voice called, leading him off the path. Hiram hesitated, remembering the rabbi's warning. "It's a trick," he muttered. But the voice sounded so real, so desperate. Against his better judgment, he followed it, pushing through the dense undergrowth. The whispers grew deafening, and the shadows closed in around him. Just as he thought he was lost, he stumbled into another clearing. At its center was a massive tree, its bark blackened and oozing sap. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, growing louder as he approached. "Hiram," the voices hissed. "Join us." And then, without warning, the earth opened beneath him, and he fell into darkness. He hit hard, the wind knocked out of him. He struggled to his feet and saw that he was in a cavern, its walls covered in glowing runes. In the center of the cavern there was a pool of black water, and standing at its edge was a figure cloaked in shadow. It turned to face him, and for the first time, Hiram felt true terror. The figure had no face, only a void where its features should have been. It raised a hand, and the whispers stopped. "Why have you come?" it asked, its voice resonating through the cavern. "I've come to end the curse," Hiram said, his voice shaking but determined. The figure laughed, a sound that echoed like thunder. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand." "We'll see about that," Hiram replied, stepping toward the pool. Hiram's heart pounded as the faceless figure loomed before him, its voice an unholy mixture of whispers and growls. The glowing runes on the cavern walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, casting an eerie glow on the black pool at the center. "Turn back," the figure warned, its formless head tilting slightly. "The heart of shadows does not forgive trespassers." But Hiram would not back down. He clenched his fists, willing himself to speak, even as the terror flowed through him. "I've come to break the curse," You won't stop me." The figure laughed, a deep, bone-chilling sound. "Break the curse," it mocked. "You cannot break what you are already part of." Hiram froze. "What do you mean?" "You bear the brand," the figure said, lifting a shadowy hand. In the dim light, Hiram stared down at his arm and gasped. Black veins snaked across his skin, pulsing in time with the runes. He hadn't noticed them before, but now they writhed beneath his flesh. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "It can't happen." "It is as real as the forest itself," the figure replied. "You are bound to the curse, just as your ancestors were. The heart is not your salvation, it is your end." Before Hiram could say anything, the cavern started shaking. The runes flared brightly, and the ground beneath him trembled. He stumbled, nearly falling into the black pool, but caught himself just in time. The figure disappeared into the shadows, its laughter echoing as the tremors grew stronger. Hiram scrambled back to the edge of the cavern, his mind racing. The rabbi's words came back to him. "The heart of shadows is the source of the curse. Destroy it, and the curse will be broken." But how could he destroy something that seemed alive, something that had already marked him? The walls of the cavern began closing in, runes dimming as the darkness took hold of the place. Hiram lit his lantern, and its weak flame barely illuminated the path forward. He had no choice but to move ahead. As Hiram walked deeper into the cave, the whispers came back again, louder, more demanding. They were saying his name, his fears, and his darkest regrets. Every step felt heavier, as if the shadows themselves weighed him down. "Hiram," a soft voice called out. He halted, caught his breath. It was his father's voice, gone so long but never forgotten. "Father?" he asked, whispering now, his voice low, turning towards the sound. "Come to me, son," the voice said, warm and yearning. "You don't have to fight anymore. Just let go." Hiram's eyes filled with tears. He hadn't heard his father's voice since the day he died, yet here it was, clear and unmistakable. "Where are you?" he asked, taking a hesitant step forward. But then another voice cut through the air, a harsher, more menacing tone. "It's a trick, Hiram. Don't listen." He froze again, divided between the two voices. His own voice called out to him from greater depths within the cavern, sounding distorted but inescapably his own. "Don't listen." "Who are you?" Hiram demanded, shaking. "I am you," his voice replied, echoing back down the cavernous space. "The part of you that remembers, the part that knows the truth." Two passages opened into the future. One shone with a weak, yellowish glow. That must be the way to safety, comfort. The other was dark and heavy with the force of bad air. Hiram stayed his step, sensed that his instincts were against making that turn into darkness. But the voices grew louder, urging him toward the darkness. "Come, Hiram. The heart awaits." He steeled himself and stepped onto the dark path, lantern barely penetrating through the darkness. The walls felt like they shut in upon him as he walked, shadows writhing, growing, changing as they ran up the sides of his vision. He stumbled into another clearing. It was larger than the last one, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center stood a stone altar, almost identical to the one he found in the forest. But this altar was different. It was covered in blood, and the runes glowed sickly red. Hiram's stomach roiled as he advanced. The whispers deafened him now, their voices overlapping in a symphony of noise that was almost impossible to describe. He extended a shaking hand to the altar, and the runes flared to life, bathing the cavern in crimson light. The light revealed figures surrounding him, shadowy, faceless beings like the one he had met earlier. They stood silent, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice quivering. One of the forms stepped forward. "We want you to see," it growled, its voice low and guttural. "See what?" The figure raised a hand and the runes on the altar changed, weaving into new patterns. Images began to materialize above the altar, scenes from the village's past. Hiram watched in horror as the truth was revealed to him. He saw the villagers cutting down the sacred trees, their axes biting into the ancient wood. He saw the forest's spirits rise in anger, their forms twisting into monstrous shapes. And he saw his ancestors performing a dark ritual, binding the spirits to the heart of shadows in a desperate bid for power. "This is the curse you inherited," the figure said. "A curse born of greed and blood." Hiram's knees gave way and he fell to the ground. "No," he whispered. "It can't be true." "It is," the figure said. "And now you must choose." The figure pointed to the altar. "The heart of shadows lies beyond this door," it said, pointing to a massive stone archway at the far end of the cavern. "But to destroy it, you must offer a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Hiram asked, dreading the answer. The faceless head of the figure turned toward him. "A life," it said simply. "Yours or hers?" Hiram's blood ran cold. "Esther?" The figure nodded. "She carries the mark as well. The forest will claim her if you do nothing. But if you offer your life, she will be spared." Hiram's thoughts were a maelstrom of fear and desperation. He could not let the forest get Esther, but would he give himself up for her sake? And if he did that too, would the curse really be broken? The whispers grew louder, urging him toward the altar. The figures closed in about him, their presence suffocating. He felt the weight of their gaze, the silent demand for a decision. He started, his voice cracking. Hiram stood frozen in front of the stone arch, surrounded by faceless figures. Their words swirled like a storm, getting noisier and noisier as the seconds ticked by. Their words bore down on his chest to make him gasp for air. "Choose," the lead figure demanded, its shadowy hand gesturing toward the altar. "The heart will take one of you. Will you offer yourself, or will she pay the price?" Hiram's mind reeled. His whole life had been defined by the curse, a silent torment passed down through generations. And now, the truth was laid bare. The heart of shadows demanded blood to sustain its power. He pushed his sleeve aside, and the black veins crawling under his skin pulsed with an identical crimson glow to the runes on the altar. The mark had followed him all this time, building in power as he walked deeper into the heart of the forest. Esther bore the mark as well, though she still didn't know it. "No," he whispered roughly. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," the figure replied, its tone cold and final. "The curse cannot be undone without sacrifice." Hiram stepped back, his eyes darting between the altar and the archway. The path beyond the stone door was shrouded in darkness, but he could feel the heart's presence pulsing like a living thing. "I'll destroy it," he said, his voice rising with defiance. "I'll end this curse without sacrificing anyone." The figures laughed. The sound rolled like 1,000 voices. "Foolish boy," one hissed. "The heart cannot be destroyed. It is eternal, as is the forest. You will only doom yourself." "Then so be it," Hiram snapped. Grabbing a jagged stone from the ground, he slashed his palm and let his blood drip onto the altar. The runes blazed to life, and the stone archway groaned open, revealing a cavern bathed in an unnatural red glow. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering as if disrupted by the act. "You dare defy the will of the forest?" the leader growled. Hiram didn't say a word. He grasped his lantern tightly and stepped through the archway, his heart thumping in his chest. The room beyond was huge, its walls covered in ancient symbols that writhed and shifted under the flickering light. In the center of the room, suspended in midair by tendrils of shadow, was the heart of shadows, a pulsating mass of black and crimson. It emitted a power that made Hiram's knees buckle, but he forced himself to move closer. He could feel its pull, a dark force clawing at his mind and soul. "You have come," a voice rumbled, deep and resonant. It emanated from the heart itself, vibrating through the chamber. "Why do you seek to defy me?" "I'm here to end the curse," Hiram said, his voice quivering but firm. "You've taken enough from us." The heart pulsed, its tendrils writhing like snakes. "You cannot end what you are part of," it said. "The forest is in your blood. You are bound to me, as were your ancestors." "Then I will destroy you," Hiram said, raising the jagged stone. The heart laughed, and the sound caused the chamber to shake. "You think that will destroy me? You are as stupid as those who have gone before you. Their blood just made me stronger. And now, yours will do the same." Hiram leapt at the heart, slashing at the tendrils of the heart with the stone. The first impact sent a wave through the room, and the heart recoiled, its laughter turning to enraged roar. "You dare!" it bellowed, its tendrils lashing out. Hiram dodged, the stone barely grazing his side as he stumbled. He struck again, this time aiming for the core. The heart screamed, and the runes on the walls flared, flooding the chamber with blinding light. But with each strike, the black veins on Hiram's arm grew darker, spreading across his body. He could feel the curse tightening its grip, threatening to consume him entirely. "Your defiance is meaningless," the heart growled. "You will become one with me, as all others have." Hiram gritted his teeth, his resolve unwavering. He could feel the forest's energy coursing through him, a power both alien and familiar. If he couldn't destroy the heart by force, perhaps he could use its own power against it. He let the stone go and reached out his hands to the heart, stepping closer. The tendrils licked at him. He did not back away. "If I'm a part of you," he said, "then take me, take all of me." The heart paused, its pulses slowing, its voice containing a note of incredulity. "What are you doing?" Hiram closed his eyes, attuning himself to the energy in his body. He could feel the life of the forest surging through him, the same power that powered the heart, and he gave himself over as a conduit. The heart let out a deafening scream. Its tendrils wrapped around him like a shroud. Pain ravaged his body as the curse reached its height, but he held firm. The crimson light grew brighter still, and the chamber began to shake. "You cannot contain me," the heart roared. "I'm not containing you," Hiram said through gritted teeth. "I'm ending you." With one final surge of energy, he willed the curse to break. The light exploded, and the heart shattered into countless fragments, each dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, Hiram collapsed to the ground, his body trembling. The chamber was silent, the oppressive energy gone. He opened his eyes and saw Esther standing at the entrance, her face pale with fear. "Hiram?" she called, running to his side. "It's over," he whispered. "The heart is gone." She led him to his feet, and together they staggered out of the cavern. The forest, which had seemed so dark and ominous, now appeared peaceful. The air was fresh, and the whispers were gone. As they approached the village, they found the townsfolk waiting. Their faces were etched with a mix of fear and hope. "The curse," an elder whispered. "Is it?" "It's broken," Hiram said. The villagers erupted in cheers, their relief palpable. But Hiram knew the cost. He could still feel the forest's mark on him, a faint reminder of the darkness he had faced. Over time, the forest began to mend. The previously twisted trees regained their straight shape and strength. The animals started returning, and the villagers were rebuilt, their lives no longer eclipsed by the fear of losing everything. Still, Hiram felt that the forest's power had not completely left it. He still felt himself wander toward its boundary, listening for the whispers he no longer heard. One evening, as the sun set and the moon rose, Esther found him standing at the forest's edge. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. Hiram didn't answer at first. He stared into the trees, his mind filled with the memories of what he had endured. Finally, he turned to her and smiled. "For now," he said. As they walked through the forest and back to the village, it was bathed in silver from the moon. Yet, though the curse was gone, the mystery of the place remained. It spoke of the darkness once ruling there, and deep inside the trees where the heart used to beat, a small rune began faintly to gleam.